Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching anatomy and physiology since 2002. I'm glad to have you back. I hope you really enjoyed that conversation I had in my previous episode with Jason Denon, who is a triathlete and skydiving accident survivor. That was an incredible story, and if you haven't listened to it yet, I highly recommend giving it a shot. The story he shares is nothing short of amazing. But we are going to move on with content today, and we're going to get into blood vessels. But before that, I want to share a question that I got from a listener this past week. And that listener wanted to know about blood plasma. Her name is Eliza, and she wrote to me from Melbourne, Australia. And Eliza wanted to know why there isn't a synthetic substitute for blood plasma since it is made up mostly of water. And there actually is an industry that is trying to manufacture synthetic blood. Unfortunately, nobody has come up with something that works yet. So there's currently no truly safe and effective artificial blood on the market. And one of the reasons for that is that blood plasma, while it's 92+% water, that other component is a very unique combination of solutes like electrolytes and proteins, and antibodies, enzymes, hormones, all kinds of things that are circulating through your blood that are really important to making sure that the right materials get to your cells and the right materials get away from your cells. I didn't even mention blood gases. For example, carbon dioxide, which we transport mostly in the blood plasma as carbonic acid. We'll talk more about that when we get to respiratory episodes. What you'll notice, though, is that in a clinical setting, sometimes people will be given saline solutions, which is a saltwater solution that mimics the concentration of blood plasma and is used as a plasma volume expander. So it doesn't replace plasma, but it can help to restore fluid volume in your body when you are dehydrated or when there is some blood loss. But it's not enough to just completely use as a replacement for blood plasma. So to answer your question, Eliza, there are companies who are trying to come up with something. They are in clinical trials. This is according to the National Center for Biotechnology information. But at the moment, there are no safe alternatives to blood on the market. All right, having said that, I think maybe it's time that we get into blood vessels. Blood vessels are the tubes that blood travels through to get all over our bodies and perform its functions. You've probably heard of the three primary vessel types, which are arteries, capillaries, and veins. There are more vessels than that, arterioles and venules. These are the smaller arteries and the smaller veins. And we're going to get into all of those in terms of the traveling direction of blood. But let's take a look at the anatomy of blood vessels first. If we use the heart as the starting point, the path blood takes through its vessels always begins with arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. The first two arteries emerging from the heart are the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle and the ascending aorta from the left ventricle. The pulmonary trunk carries oxygen-poor blood to the lungs, where carbon dioxide will be exchanged for oxygen. This is called the pulmonary circuit. The large ascending aorta, aortic arch, and descending aorta give rise to myriad smaller arteries that carry oxygen-rich blood toward the systemic tissues. So we call this the systemic circuit. When we think about arteries versus veins, arteries are resistance vessels because they consistently hold their shape, kind of like a rubber garden hose, providing much resistance to the flow of blood. Arteries are broken down into classes by size, histology, and also their function. Each class of artery is known by multiple names. We have the large arteries like the aorta and pulmonary trunk, which are also known as conducting arteries or elastic arteries. They're kind of like the trunks of a tree that give way to a lot of branches, but they don't typically deliver blood to any specific tissues themselves. The medium-sized branches coming from the conducting arteries, like the radial artery in your wrist or the gastric arteries that supply your stomach, are called distributing arteries or muscular arteries. They take the blood towards specific organs. The femoral artery, the ulnar artery, the brachial artery. These are those kinds of arteries. The distributing arteries branch off into small arteries, also known as resistance arteries. The narrowest resistance arteries are specifically known as arterioles, and their diameters expand and contract, controlling blood flow to the tissues they supply. In fact, no arteries have as much control over how much blood is delivered to which organs as arterioles do. I like to describe our circulatory system with a phrase called the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And basically what that means is that we only have X amount of blood circulating through our bodies. So when we are active and we need blood to get to certain areas, especially if you're exercising, your heart rate's going to go up and it's going to pump more blood per minute. But what part of your body are you exercising? Are you doing something active with your arms, or are you running and very active with the muscles of your legs? So our body has to determine which of the tissues are most active, using the most ATP, the most oxygen, and producing the most carbon dioxide, and those tissues need to get the most blood. So through our nervous system stimulation to these arterioles, we can expand the ones that go to tissues that need blood right now, and we can constrict the ones that go to tissues that are not as essential at the moment. So by using this expansion and contraction, we can divert blood to the areas that need it the most, and we can divert blood away from the areas that don't need it so much. Now, most of those arterioles branch out into microscopic vessels called capillaries. And those are our exchange vessels. This is where blood plasma and its solutes can leave the circulatory system and deliver nutrients, oxygen, hormones, electrolytes, and more to the tissues. Meanwhile, interstitial fluid can be reabsorbed through the capillary walls into the circulatory system, carrying cellular products like hormones, as well as metabolic wastes that the cells produce. Capillaries converge and give way to the venous system, which carries blood back toward the right atrium of the heart. So those arterioles, when they branch out into capillaries, one arteriole is going to branch out into many, many capillaries. So there's a divergence there. And when those capillaries start returning blood to the venous system, they need to converge so that many, many capillaries will converge into one venule. And those veins are our capacitance vessels because they're more flexible than arteries and they have a greater capacity for blood. In fact, most of the blood at any given time is in veins. Now, just like we had arterioles as the smaller branches of arteries, we have venules, which are the smaller veins leading to the larger veins. So capillaries are going to converge directly into venules. And we call those venules at the end of a capillary post-capillary venules. They drain blood from the capillaries or directly from meta-arterioles that bypass capillaries. Some exchange takes place via these post-capillary venules because they're even more porous than capillaries. So when you think about which vessels are able to exchange blood with the interstitial fluid, it's not just capillaries, it's also some venules. In fact, most of the movement of white blood cells from the blood to the tissues is through postcapillary venules. So those venules are going to funnel blood into the muscular venules, which are larger in diameter and eventually give way and converge into larger medium veins. These are the veins you've probably heard of, like the femoral vein of the thigh or the brachial vein of the upper arm. While pressure is the driving force of blood in the arteries and capillaries, pressure is too low in most medium veins to overcome the force of gravity and get blood back to the heart. So many medium veins have epithelial valves that prevent the backflow of blood during venous return. This is unique to veins. Arteries don't have valves that make sure blood is traveling in the right direction because there's so much pressure in arteries that the blood can only go in one direction. It is forced by the pressure produced by the beating heart and the fluid in that closed system of vessels. But in veins, the pressure is so low that it's really difficult for the blood to get back up, especially in your lower limbs, to your heart. So valves make sure that when the blood gets to a certain level, it only falls back a small amount. Now, some veins are thin-walled dilations of a vein with no smooth muscle called a venous sinus. Venous sinuses can't constrict like other veins. If you think back of the episode about the brain, we saw some examples of these, like the dural venous sinus. And later on, we'll talk about the heart, and you'll see something called the coronary sinus. Medium veins converge with other medium veins to form large veins, like the renal veins of the kidneys, the internal jugular veins of your neck, pulmonary veins of the lungs, and the superior and inferior vena cava, which funnel blood directly into the right atrium of the heart from the rest of the body. Now remember that anatomy also consists of histology, so we need to consider the microscopic anatomy, or histology, of arteries and veins as well. And they actually have some similarities, but also some important differences that are directly linked to their unique functions as vessels. Let's start with the similarities. I think that's probably the best way to approach it. When we consider arteries and veins, each has 3 layers called tunics. The innermost or deepest is the tunica interna, the middle is the tunica media, and the outermost, or the most superficial, is the tunica externa. The space inside of a hollow vessel, remember, is called a lumen. And in this case, it's where the blood's going to be. The tunica interna lines the lumen with endothelium. Endothelium is the term we give to an epithelial lining of the inside of a vessel or the heart. We call that the endothelium. And in this case, it is simple squamous epithelial tissue and its basement membrane. That endothelium is going to regulate which materials can enter and exit the circulatory system. It's also going to determine what's going to chemically stimulate vessel constriction and dilation. And in the absence of injury, it prevents formed elements from sticking to the vessel wall. You don't want the red blood cells and white blood cells sticking to the endothelium because then they won't be able to travel to where they need to go. However, if you remember from the episode that we covered hemostasis, there are some instances when we have a ruptured blood vessel that, because of that damaged endothelium, we will get formed elements sticking to it. The tunica media is responsible for changing the diameter of the vessel because it is rich with smooth muscle. And contraction and relaxation of that smooth muscle will constrict and dilate the vessel respectively, meaning that contraction constricts it, makes the vessel narrower, and relaxation of those muscles dilate the vessel, which makes the diameter larger. In addition to smooth muscle, the tunica media also has collagen and sometimes elastic tissue, which helps promote the durability and the resistance to damage brought on by blood pressure. The proportion of the tunica media's components varies based on which vessel we're looking at. But it's really important to have elasticity because if you think about your blood pressure and your pulse, right? So the reason why you can put your finger on your radial artery in your wrist and feel a pulse is because every time the heart beats, it's forcing more blood into the vessels, and the vessels are going to have to expand to accommodate that. So you get this rush of blood, the vessel expands for a very short period of time, and then snaps back to its original shape. That's super important because that elasticity, that snapping back, will also help propel blood forward. And if you don't have that elasticity, if the artery is not flexible and when the pulse comes through, it doesn't expand, then we've got problems. We could damage the endothelial lining, and also we can affect blood flow because we're not going to have that expansion and recoil action. The tunica externa consists of loose connective tissue, which helps connect blood vessels to nearby tissues, organs, nerves, and other vessels. The tissue that comprise the tunica media and externa can't always obtain their oxygen and nutrients from the blood coursing through the vessel lumen. So the larger vessels actually have their own blood supply to provide that service from the outside. Typically, small vessels penetrate the tunica externa in the form of what's called a vasovessorum. So that's a look at the similarities, but let's also take a look at some of the key differences between the different classes of arteries themselves. The tunica media of the conducting arteries consists of dozens of layers of elastic tissue mixed in with collagen, smooth muscle, and elastic fibers. The elasticity of the conducting arteries allows them to expand when the heart beats and recoil back to their original size, like I mentioned earlier. The tunica media of distributing arteries have up to 40 layers of smooth muscle. It also has an internal elastic lamina between the tunica media and interna, and an external elastic lamina between the tunica media and externa. The resistance arteries, or small arteries, and arterioles have up to 25 layers of smooth muscle and much less elastic tissue than the other classes of arteries. The proportionally large amount of smooth muscle gives them the ability to expand and contract, diverting blood to or away from specific tissues. This is based on their own individual requirements at any given time. So, like I said earlier, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and in most cases, the tissues will make a case for themselves with the chemicals they produce based on their activity level. That will help determine whether the blood vessel will expand or contract. Now, the downside of arteries is that they're going to a particular tissue to give them a blood and oxygen supply. So if flow through an artery is somehow blocked or the artery is damaged, the tissue it supplies is going to lose its blood supply. And when we have a low blood supply, we call that ischemia. And it leads to a low oxygen level, which we call hypoxia. And this is because specific tissues rely on specific arteries for their supply.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing facility, he knows keeping the line up and running is a top priority. That's why he chooses Grainger. Because when a drive belt gets damaged, Grainger makes it easy to find the exact specs for the replacement product he needs. And next day delivery helps ensure he'll have everything in place and running like clockwork. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Veins are different because veins are all heading back to the heart. So since they're all going back to the same place, with a few exceptions, if one of them gets blocked, blood can just be rerouted through other veins to get back to the heart, and will produce new veins to take its place. Since venules lead to medium veins and medium veins lead to large veins, the smaller veins in the venous system are not branches per se, they're tributaries bringing blood to larger vessels, like a stream leading to a river. Now, while arterial walls hold their shape and remain patent, even when the pressure inside drops, veins don't do that. When veins lose their pressure, they collapse or flatten out. And since the pressure is so much lower in veins, they don't have to have these big, thick externa walls to resist that pressure. They also have far less elastic tissue than arteries because they're not subjected to that pulsating pressure from the beating of the heart. Now, even though it's less than arteries, veins do have smooth muscle and they are capable of vasoconstriction. But like I said earlier, the main difference we see in veins is in the endothelium of medium veins, which contain infoldings of epithelial tissue that act as valves, preventing gravity from pulling blood away from the heart when the pressure is low. Now, even though the pressure in veins is really low, what is there does contribute to what we call venous return, which is the blood in the veins getting back to the heart. So there is an influence from pressure, even though the pressure is not that much. But the pressure is not enough. It's way too low. For veins above the heart, you got gravity. So that's easy. So when you're standing, when you're upright, gravity helps bring blood back to the heart. But below the heart, we've got to rely on a couple of pumping systems that are going to help get that blood back. The first one is the skeletal muscle pump. Now, what happens is veins travel through your skeletal muscles, especially in your legs. And when those muscles contract, they squeeze the veins, and that squeezes the blood in them toward the heart. Now, when that contraction stops, you'd expect the blood to fall back down to your feet. But we've got those valves. And since those valves are closed when there's no pressure being exerted on the vein, the blood can only fall back to the most recent valve. So the next time the skeletal muscle contracts, it will push more blood up toward the heart. When this becomes a problem is if someone is bedridden or someone's sitting in the same position for a long period of time, and if you're not contracting those muscles, then you're allowing blood to pool in your lower extremities. And when blood is allowed to pool and become stagnant, that's when blood clots can form. And we don't want those blood clots forming because they can block your veins, or worse, they can free themselves up and travel to your lungs where they become a pulmonary embolism. So a blood clot is called a thrombus. And a blood clot in one of these deeper veins, like in your calf muscle, is called a deep vein thrombosis. A thrombosis that is now been freed and is traveling through the circulatory system is called an embolus. And when it gets to your lungs, it can block your pulmonary arteries, and that is an emergency situation. We call that a pulmonary embolism. So what you'll notice is that sometimes people who are on really long flights, because they're sitting in the same position for a very long time and the pressure in the cabin is changing, they'll get up and walk around. And doctors will suggest you do that. If you notice someone who's in a hospital bed for a long period of time, they will have someone come in and move their legs around and also kind of squeeze their calves from the ankles toward their knees. That's kind of a way of milking the blood back toward the heart so that it doesn't form what's called bed sores, which is when the blood pools for so long that you end up with these pooling blood in your tissues, and that's not good either. Now, there's no skeletal muscles in the middle of your thoracic and abdominal cavity, so what happens when the blood actually gets up past your hips? Then how we're getting it back to the heart? Well, in that case, we're going to use the respiratory pump. This is associated with the breathing. This is associated with the changes in pressure in your abdominal and thoracic cavities that happens when you breathe. When you inhale, the abdominal pressure increases while the thoracic pressure drops. And what that does is it increases the pressure on the abdominal inferior vena cava, making it greater than what's in the thoracic vena cava. And that means blood will travel from the area of high pressure to low pressure, which would be from abdominal to thoracic or closer to your heart. Now, when we exhale, the pressure in the thoracic cavity increases and the pressure in the abdominal cavity decreases. And that is going to increase the pressure on the thoracic veins, pushing the blood back toward the heart. And there's another pressure influence that's happening as well. When the ventricles of the heart contract, the atria of the heart expand. So the atria are the two smaller superior chambers of our four-chambered heart. The ventricles are the larger, more muscular lower chambers. So when those ventricles contract, the atria expand. And that creates a little bit of negative pressure inside the atria, which kind of sucks blood from the vena cava into the right atrium and from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. And we call that cardiac suction. So those are the three different mechanisms that we use to get blood back to the heart. The small amount of pressure in veins, the two pumps, skeletal and respiratory, and the cardiac suction. All right, finally, that's going to bring us to capillaries. There are three different kinds of capillaries: continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoids. They're each histologically unique, and so we're going to take a look at them independently. Capillaries in general are unique because they don't have three tunics. Instead, they just have an endothelium and, with the exception of sinusoids, a basal lamina. The basal lamina is a thin layer surrounding the epithelium made of protein and carbohydrate. And this thin wall helps facilitate the easy passage of contents between the bloodstream and the interstitial fluid in many ways. On average, the proximal end of a capillary is about 5 micrometers in diameter, and the distal end is about 9 micrometers in diameter. Now, when I say proximal end, I'm talking about the arterial side of a capillary. And when I say distal end, I'm typically talking about the venous side. Now, not all capillaries go arterial to venial. There are some exceptions. And when we see a system that doesn't go arterial, capillary, venial, and then back to the heart, we call that a portal system. So there are some areas in our bodies where we're going to see more than one set of capillaries before we get back to the heart. So it might go arterial, capillary, venial. So when we say arterial end versus venial end, it doesn't always work that way. So even though proximal and distal is not necessarily used in the circulatory system, I'm using it in this way according to the direction of blood flow. Because I don't want to misstate that all capillaries have a venial end, because not all capillaries do have a venial end. Now, this 5 micrometers in diameter is barely large enough to fit a 7.5 micrometer red blood cell. Now, luckily, red blood cells are flexible and they can squeeze through the capillary as they bend, so they do make their way through. But some capillaries, their diameter is basically enough for red blood cells to go through single file. That's how small these microscopic capillaries are. So when we think about a micrometer, which is also called a micron, that is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, meaning that 1,000 micrometers can fit into 1 millimeter. It's really small. So we talked about 3 types of structurally different capillaries. And again, they were continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoids. So let's look at them because their structure is going to dictate their function. We'll start with the continuous capillaries, and they're found nearly all throughout the body. The squamous cells of their endothelium are bound to each other with tight junctions. And except for in the brain, between the endothelial cells are intercellular clefts, which are small spaces about 4 nanometers wide. And they allow the passage of small molecules like glucose as it's delivered to the tissue fluid. But they're too small for proteins and cells to pass through. In some continuous capillaries, you'll notice these long, thin extensions wrapping around the basal lamina. Those are called tendrils of pericytes, and they're made of a form of actin and myosin proteins similar to what we see in skeletal muscle. Those proteins may actually contract, squeezing the capillary to help regulate the blood that's flowing through it. Now, another type of capillary is fenestrated capillaries. The Italian word finestra means little window. So the endothelial cells of fenestrated capillaries have a huge number of tiny holes going through them, which we call filtration pores or fenestrations. Filtration pores can be up to 100 nanometers in diameter, which is a lot larger than those intercellular clefts. So blood cells, most proteins, and other large particles still can't fit through them. But blood plasma and interstitial fluid, as well as the small molecules dissolved in them, can pass through them pretty quickly. Fenestrated capillaries are found where rapid filtration of water and solutes is required, like in the kidneys, the small intestine, the endocrine glands, and the choroid plexus of the brain's ventricles. So again, look back at some old episodes when we talk about the blood-brain barrier and cerebrospinal fluid production. The choroid plexus of the brain's ventricles are the blood vessels that are going to force blood plasma through them into the brain's ventricles. And the ependymal cells that line those brain's ventricles are going to contribute to the solute concentrations that make cerebrospinal fluid different from blood plasma. The last type of capillary is sinusoids, and these are the largest. They're about 40 micrometers wide. So they're so much bigger than the other capillaries we saw. And they typically hug the tissues surrounding them and basically take on their shape. We see sinusoids in the bone marrow, the liver, and the lymphatic organs. The endothelial cells are far from one another, leaving really large spaces between them. And they also have no basal lamina. So they're attached directly to the cells of the underlying tissues they supply. Now, they might also have fenestrations, so proteins, blood cells, and other large molecules can pass through. We'll use an example of sinusoids in the liver. Liver cells are called hepatocytes. And so these large protein-based products of hepatocytes can make their way into the bloodstream through these sinusoids. Even blood cells can fit through the sinusoids of the bone marrow and the lymphatic organs, like the spleen, which is good because those are the places where we are producing blood or making sure blood matures. So it's important for blood cells to be able to fit through the gaps in these sinusoids in those areas. Now, depending on their location, the sinusoids might have specialized cells to help them carry out tissue functions. Sticking with the liver, the sinusoids there have macrophages, which we sometimes call Kupffer cells. Those cells phagocytize foreign debris in the blood coming from the digestive tract. And that brings me to one of the biggest portal systems we have. So when blood goes into the small intestine, large intestine, stomach, etc., it can't just absorb what you've consumed and send that blood right back into your general circulation. There's too many toxins, minerals, vitamins, nutrients, and things like that that are coming through your digestive system that have to be processed before they can just be exposed to your nervous tissue and other tissues. So we have what's called the hepatic portal system. All the veins coming from the digestive tract are going to lead to a vein called the hepatic portal vein, and that vein will bring all that blood into the liver. And the liver cells will process all of the things that you absorbed from your digestive tract. It's going to process glucose and store it as glycogen. It's going to take the minerals and vitamins and store those. It's going to take the toxins and get rid of those or process them or break them down so we can get rid of them. So we call it the hepatic portal system because all that blood goes to your liver first. When the liver's done with it, it will send that blood into a series of veins that will eventually lead back to the inferior vena cava, and that blood can head up toward your heart. Capillaries are dispersed throughout your body with a few exceptions. Like I said earlier, one arteriole will diverge into many capillaries, and those capillaries are typically arranged kind of like a cargo net, which we call a capillary bed. And capillary beds blanket a region of tissue so that they can disperse the blood according to those tissues' needs. In places like the mesentery of the intestine, which is the thin membrane that holds your intestines in place, arterioles give way to what's called meta-arterioles, which are directly connected to small veins called venules, but can divert blood to capillaries that are regulated by precapillary sphincters, controlling blood flow on the demand from the tissues they supply. So basically, what does that mean? I just said a bunch of words. And the sphincters are circular bands of muscle that will constrict if that tissue doesn't need a huge blood supply at the moment, stopping blood from going into the capillaries and instead allowing the blood to go to those meta-arterioles that bypass the capillaries. If the tissue is in need of blood at the moment, is metabolically very active, for example, those sphincters will relax and allow blood to go through the capillaries instead of bypassing the capillaries. So we call those precapillary sphincters, and they will help control the blood flow based on the demand from the tissues they supply. All right, that's a good intro to blood vessels and blood vessel anatomy. We'll get into blood pressure and other aspects of blood vessels in the next episode. So I hope that this information has helped you get your B or better in A&P so that you can be successful. I want to thank Eliza from Melbourne, Australia for sending me a question. I appreciate you listening and I appreciate your question. I want to thank all my listeners. Once again, without you, I wouldn't do this. So I really appreciate you listening. We've got some really interesting news from Spotify. Spotify has us listed as one of the top education podcasts available on Spotify. So I really appreciate the rankings and the reviews that listeners have given me. Also, a lot of listeners post comments on Spotify specifically, where they just kind of say whether or not they liked an episode or whether or not it's helped them. And I appreciate those. And whenever I get them, I publish them so that anyone can read them. So I appreciate that. It's really, really nice to hear people engaging, and the fact that people are liking the podcast and they feel like it's helping them in A&P. That's all I need. Having said that, I would appreciate it if you told as many people as possible. Share it on social media. Tell your classmates, tell your professors, tell your teachers. Let them know this podcast exists, because the more listeners we get, the better it's going to serve everybody. If you tell as many people as possible, you rate, you review the podcast on whatever service you're using, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So thank you for doing that. And once again, if you have a question and you'd like it answered on another episode, please email me at minus55media@gmail.com, and I will do my best to answer your question. Thank you once again for listening. I really appreciate it. I will talk to you next week. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media. Please take the time to rate the podcast, and don't forget to check out my YouTube channel, Student Help for AP. That's Student Help, the number 4, AP. There's a whole lot of tutor videos on there that I think you're going to find helpful. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost, tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology, already being used at several colleges and universities.